Have you tried Music to Code By yet? Well, why not? Here's a comment Joe left on the website. This is also great music to mow by. I like listening to music while doing yard work to help the monotony of it seem less tedious. This past summer, I started listening to these tracks while doing yard work, and they worked great. I could let the music play in the background without focusing on it, and it seemed to help me concentrate on getting through my tasks. Thanks, Joe. And now you can download the entire 13-track collection. That's over 5.5 hours of music to code by for only $39. Check it out at musictocodeby.net. Welcome back to .NET Rocks. This is Carl Franklin.
And this is Richard Campbell.
Back in the studio for a few shows we're recording here, and this is going to be a good one because Jess Chadwick is here, and we're going to hear all about Razor. What's old and what's new. But before that, I was sent a Better Know a Framework suggestion, which is a YouTube video. I don't often do YouTube videos, but this one is from Ben Brandt, and he basically shows how he made a programmable box joint jig, to cut wood with a jig using a Raspberry Pi.
That's awesome.
And that is at 1475.pwop.me. I'm just going to take a minute so that Richard can watch this video, and we'll pause this and we'll come back after you've watched it. What do you think of that, Richard?
That's very cool, my friend. It's cool. But yeah, you get to mix electronics and a table saw once, and then you have shrapnel.
Yeah. It's pretty cool
I
that,
love it.
A few $100s and a table saw, and you've got what essentially would cost probably thousands of dollars in a professional.
Oh, yeah, without a doubt.
Yeah.
Well, and I mean, does take some tinkering and care and feeding. When you think about a professional setup where the electronics all have to be hardened and so forth, you can understand why the stuff's so expensive.
Yeah.
It is interesting to see that the general purpose computing, stuff like Raspberry Pis, are now so inexpensive that it's cheaper than any of the other embedded solutions.
Yeah, agreed.
And that just sort of changes the game. It means that, hey, I have a web server in my table saw. That's I think the place we're going to end up. Everything has an IP address. Everything is log-onable.
Not everything. Don't connect your teapots, people. Just saying.
I've met some pretty interesting teapots recently where you literally tell the teapot what kind of tea you want to make, and it boils accordingly.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Not a fan.
You don't have an appropriate appreciation of tea, I believe.
Suppose not. You and Stephen Fry, gadget guys.
Yeah. That's a cool one, dude. Nice find.
That's what I got. Who's talking to us, buddy?
Grabbed a comment off of show 1470, the one we did with Barry Dorans at NDC. As I recall, it was on the last day, so we were well into the whiskey.
I believe we were. Yes, we were.
And Barry enjoys a tipple or two, and so I think we're about half in the bag by halfway through this show.
But it was a good show, though.
It was a fun show, and we had good. How much fun can security really be?
Well, we made it as fun as it could possibly be,
and that's basically the comment that we got on the show. This is from Subiek, who said, "I woke up this morning and looked at my podcast downloads and saw a new .NET Rocks with Troy Hunt. I was super excited. The guy is just incredible. He's handsome, funny, smart, and a fabulous house with a great view. And he lets me know when my accounts have been pwned. He sure is amazing. Wait a second, where's Troy?"
Yeah.
Security at ASP.NET. This is obviously a Troy Hunt show. This is literally how the comment is written. Who's this other guy? And then finished with, that was a great show. I love when you guys get silly. Please have Barry on more often.
Absolutely. We promise.
Well, and Subiec's not wrong. We tend to have Troy on to talk about security stuff, and it's great to have Barry on as well, which we clearly don't do often enough. he is in the process of defining what security in ASP.NET Core looks like in the future. You know, it's a big deal. And coincidentally, I mean, after we recorded this show, I ended up spending a whole day with Barry when we were in Melbourne, Australia together.
Oh, cool.
And lots of conversations about the security models and just the challenges of what developers need versus, you know, the optimal security is literally a blank wall that nobody can get through. So anything more than impenetrable, like unable to get through at all, is a compromise in security. Where does that compromise live? How convenient does it have to be versus how powerful it needs to be? So it's fun. You know, security guys come across as grumpy, you know,
or maybe just not a whole lot of fun.
Well, because they work on a hard problem, and a problem I think a lot of people just see as an obstacle. So it was enjoyable for me to spend enough time with Barry to go, you know, really thinking hard about the problem. And I think we're all going to benefit. So thanks to Barry and thanks to Sobiek, because without your comment, I wouldn't get to talk about this. So a .NET Rocks mug is on its way to you. And if you'd like a .NET Rocks mug, write a comment on the website at .NETRocks.com or via any of our social media, because we publish every show to Facebook and Google+. And if you comment there and we read it on the show, we'll send you a mug.
And definitely follow us on Twitter. I'm at Carl Franklin. He's at Rich Campbell. Send us a tweet. We miter the edges to decrease storage requirements. You can stack more of them when they're diagonally cut. Just saying.
Just saying.
All right. Let's bring on our guest today, Jess Chadwick. He is a lynda.com author, host of the Static Void podcast. Great name. I love that name. Founding board member of the Tech Bash Developer Conference, and a dev manager and architect at one of the 2 largest banks in the United States. But more importantly, he's a coder with over 20 years of experience writing and actually shipping software with a variety of teams in a variety of environments, from 2-person startups to 200,000-person enterprises. Welcome, Jess.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
And you are another one of these guys who's been listening to .NET Rocks for a long time and then became a guest. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I early on I wouldn't miss an episode because that's where I learned about all the new and upcoming stuff. Basically, that's where I learned what I needed to learn in order to get better. And now I just listen just to stay on top of things.
Oh, that's great.
You know, the crazy part is that I sent him a LinkedIn message, I don't know, 2013?
Yeah.
Saying,
end of 2015, yep.
Hey, you know, I've been reading your stuff for a while, and I thought maybe we should do the show together. And he replied to me, I don't know, last month.
How did you find it?
I mean, pardon the 5-year delay, but yeah.
Oh, it was stuck in my spam folder, dude.
Yeah,
sorry.
Right. Well, Richard had reached out to me and said, "What are you working on?" And at that point, I was working 80-hour weeks, so I didn't really even have time to reply to that question. So
yeah.
Now things have calmed down a little bit.
Well, what are you doing these days?
So what I'm doing these days, I'm working at a place that I can't actually specifically say where I work, but one of the 2 largest banks. And I lead a dev team, and I'm also kind of helping to drive one of many people. It's a big organization, so I can't say I'm driving it, but one of many to drive the transformation. They're calling it DevOps, but you know, just automating every step of the SDLC, seeing where we can leverage containers, just all embracing all of the new stuff, which is pretty desperately needed.
Yes,
you know, we're a little bit behind and trying to catch up, and so far it's doing pretty well.
Oh, that's great. And so the topic here is new Razor pages, or at least that's our working topic.
Yes. So
Razor is something that some of us, most of us, I think, I would hope anyway, have some experience with. But where do you want to start?
So, well, I want to start by differentiating Razor and Razor pages, because that's one of the biggest thing. It was funny when I was first looking into Razor pages, I pinged the ASP Insiders list, the group of folks who have been deeply involved with ASP.NET and the .NET framework for years and years. And I asked a question, something about how do you authenticate a Razor page? Because I couldn't find anything in the API. I couldn't find anything on the docs. And a couple people, more than one person, wrote back and said, hey, you just write a controller action and you return a view. And then, you put authorize on the MVC controller action. I said, no.
Yeah.
Razor pages, not Razor. Right. So That's the first thing. Razor pages is a new feature in .NET Core 2.0. So it's just released. As of this recording, it just released last week, I think.
Okay.
It was the RTM.
All right.
And so it's out live now. It's fully baked.
Has its roots in the Razor language, obviously.
Exactly. So the name Razor Pages comes from Razor. So you use the Razor syntax, the Razor language, the Razor view engine, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
But basically, up until now, when you've been using Razor, you've been using it in the context of an ASP.NET MVC app. It is the V in your ASP.NET MVC.
Yes.
Right.
And so you generally return that view from a controller action. And what Razor Pages does is says, let's get rid of all that ceremony, right? Let's get rid of, if you have just a simple page, how many times have you written a controller action that all it does is say return view?
Return view, right.
That is the primary target. It's not the only target or the only scenario, but that is the most optimal scenario where you're saying, why are we creating a controller? Why are we creating an action? Why are we doing the MVC when all I want is the V? All I want is the view.
Right.
And so that's kind of where Razor Pages has its roots. Make it really easy to produce content and use Razor in order to do that, right? So you can still have programmability in your views. You can still create dynamic views, and you can still have access to the really awesome Razor view engine and the Razor syntax, but without creating controllers and all that stuff. So basically the way that it works is you create a new .cs HTML page, just the same as you would today. Instead of putting it in a views folder, you're putting it in a pages folder. And out of the box, that just kind of maps to that name in the URL, right? So under pages, if you say pages/home or about.cs HTML, and then you go to your site, mysite.com/about, the routing is just kind of there. And it's all part of the default MVC routing. And so that's the interesting part, is that this is built on top of MVC.
Right.
So you create a new MVC app, but you don't have any of the controller folders or view folders or any of that MVC stuff, but all of the libraries and everything are still there when and if you need them. And this is just kind of a simpler model on top of that.
Well, I always thought that using Razor as a, view in the context of MVC was kind of like putting two things together. Like MVC is really something that is great for static pages and it's great for serving up content. But as far as interactive stuff, it's kind of like, what? Why do I need to do all that?
Yeah,
right?
That's the really interesting thing, because I've been diving into Razor Pages lately, and Razor Pages is very cool to solve those pretty basic scenarios. Those scenarios where you don't necessarily need that huge separation of concerns, the loose coupling and separation of concerns that MVC is really good at. And you really, on that spectrum of tightly coupled to loosely coupled, you're more toward the tightly coupled side, and you're totally fine because it's really not that advanced, right? Or there are folks who are really, they say, loose coupling, at least in that regard, it's not really necessary for these types of scenarios. They're not disregarding loose coupling altogether, but they're saying it's a little bit of overkill.
Well, you see this happen over and over again, right? When a really good sound architectural design gets very popular, and you have the dogmatic people that are, you must do this, and it's good because it does force those constraints on you.
Yep.
But then, over time, people get to see, we could actually do this a lot easier and better without so many layers.
Yeah.
Or without so much of it.
Yeah. Well, so it's very interesting. In the beginning, when it was in beta, and there was literally one page of docs on the Microsoft site. If you went down, because now on the Microsoft docs, you can actually post comments. And
thanks, Bill Wagner.
Down at the bottom, there was a whole bunch of comments saying, 80% of them were, "Oh my God, burn this with fire. This is awful." Right? I mean, it's people who are just really, really used to the MVC design pattern, and I think that MVC came along, ASP.NET MVC came along, kind of overshadowed web forms because there was a lot of pain in dealing with web forms. Web forms really had its roots in the whole drag and drop, make it easy for those VB6 developers to get on the web. And don't worry about the HTML. We'll render all that for you.
Pay no attention to that view state behind the curtain.
Exactly. Right. But then you get things like view state and a lot of things that, in nice terms, you could say, oh, they're not so great. In bad terms, just complete awful. That not stuff that you want, not scalable, a whole lot of bad things.
It's only awful if people use it. As long as nobody goes on your site, it works like a hot damn.
Right. And one of the big complaints, especially for me personally with web pages, was it wasn't testable. You always had to do browser automation to actually test this stuff.
Sure.
And so MVC came along, and it I don't know if it solved all those problems, but it really helped a lot. And it really encouraged that better separation of concerns by default.
Yep.
You know, we're going to create this model view controller for you. That's how the framework works. You should put your code in the controller and keep your views simple. There's nothing saying that you can't, right? Like you can write bad code in a good framework and good code in a bad framework. But
what Kate Gregory's line is, Microsoft, it's your foot.
Right. Exactly.
I think C++, but I think I can't think it can apply to a lot of things these days.
Yeah. I mean, it's a tool.
Yeah, well, I think if you get too opinionated so that people just can't do things, then they won't use it because it's too restrictive. You've got to leave them enough freedom to do something stupid and then encourage them not to do it.
Well, exactly. JavaScript is a prime example of that, right? JavaScript.
Doing something stupid? Okay.
No. When I think of separation of concerns, JavaScript isn't the first thing that comes to mind. You know what I'm saying? I mean, you have global variables. They all live in the view. I mean, talk about non-separation. And that didn't stop JavaScript from becoming really powerful, really prevalent, and, everywhere.
Yeah.
Ubiquitous.
Sure. Right. And so it's all about what's productive, right? That's the interesting thing is that you can argue productivity for both sides. In the beginning, when you're just trying to get that minimal thing out the door, productive is throwing away all these patterns and architecture and everything and just getting the thing written. And then over time, you collect that debt and all of a sudden, it's not so productive.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So that's the interesting thing. And my take on Razor Pages after doing it for a couple months now is I think it tends to encourage tighter coupling. Right. I kind of already said that, but
wait a minute. Now you're talking about Razor Pages.
Razor Pages.
Yes.
Right. So Razor Pages, not Razor in MVC, but Razor Pages.
Now you told us how easy it was, but I'm still trying to figure out what a Razor page might look like.
Okay. Right. So let's back up a little bit. So a Razor page is just the CSHTML file, just sitting there. Like you could have a project of just CSHTML files. In those files, you can write some code blocks, and those code blocks can do whatever you want them to do, right? They can go and call a database, just like in classic ASP, right?
And you're talking server-side code blocks.
This is server-side. This is all, yes. Razor Pages is a server-side rendering framework, just like Razor in MVC, just like MVC is a server-side framework. Okay. Razor is all happening on the server. Now, I mean, some listeners might be confused because Steve Sanderson just came on, on one of the recent episodes talking about Blazor. This is not anything to do with that.
Right.
No.
Okay.
Right. This is real actual production stuff happening now. And so this is just kind of a arguably more productive way of doing MVC. So you create just that view, right? And because it's dynamic, because it's server side, you are going to want to write some code, and you are going to maybe, contact a database, pull some data out of a database, maybe save some data back to a database, those kind of scenarios. And so that's the kind of stuff that you're doing kind of right in the page. Now,
it reminds me of another technology. What was it? ASP.
Yes. So you don't want to do that, right? You don't want to do that. You don't want to put it all in your CSHTML. You can if you want to. You don't want to.
Right.
So they have the concept of let's see, a C# file right next to the page, the Razor page.
Code behind, perhaps.
Code. Yeah, right. You might say it's code next to or perhaps behind the page, right?
I see. This is a fascinating idea.
So the mechanics of this start to actually look a little bit like MVC, but not exactly, right? So you
mean ASP.NET?
ASP.NET MVC.
MVC,
Yes. And so you end up making a class. It's not a controller with actions. It is a class that is the model or the back end to that page. So that's where we're talking about tight coupling, right?
Right.
And so you put all your code in there. And that class is just a class. It derives from a base class. That's part of the Razor Pages framework. But when we're talking about testability, just create a new instance of that class and start calling methods, that kind of thing, right?
I get it. So the class can exist without the view, but not the other way around.
Exactly. And so now, then you jump back into that Razor view that had all of that logic in there, calling the database and everything, copy and paste that, cut that out of the view, paste it in there, map it back into your view. And now your view just has one line. It says my model and this is the app model, exactly like in Razor in MVC. My model for this page is this page model. That's what it's called. A Razor Pages page model is the base class. And so that base class has a number of conventions. So you can put properties on it. It is just a class, right? It's a C# class.
Right.
So you can put properties on it to access in the view, just like you would when you're creating your view models or the models that you send to your views in MVC. But the conventions really come into play when we're talking about methods. So these methods are very much kind of like web API methods, and they're very tightly referencing the HTTP methods that are being called, right? So you make...
This is getting really fascinating, but I got to ask you to pause right there because it's a perfect time to hear from our sponsor. This episode of .NET Rocks is made possible in part by Windows on the Google Cloud Platform.
What? Isn't this a .NET show?
Yeah, .NET runs on the Google Cloud Platform, man.
Everything in .NET?
You bet. All the .NET Core libraries and more, including 200 plus Google.com and cloud services. Hey, John Skeet's behind it. He's a genius.
The John Skeet? The Rescue the Princess John Skeet from Stack Overflow?
Yeah, the one and only. You can deploy your ASP.NET Windows apps to Compute Engine or your ASP.NET Core apps to App Engine or Container Engine, which is Google's hosted Kubernetes environment, and it runs like, well, Google.
What about Visual Studio integration? Oh, it's there. I'm reading it now. You can use Visual Studio to manage your GCP resources and deploy your existing apps.
Yep. You can get stack driver logging, error reporting, and tracing support for .NET and .NET Core.
Also, there are PowerShell commandlets for GCP, which run on Windows and Linux.
And if you need help, there are a great set of partners to get workloads to GCP, including Capgemini, Nudesic, and Magenic.
So go to gcp.netrocks.com and get your free trial today.
.NET on Google. Who knew? And we're back. This is .NET Rocks, and we're talking to Jess Chadwick about new Razor Pages. And I left you right in the middle where you were talking about methods.
Yes. So these page models have a lot of good conventions that are really kind of tightly coupled to or bound to the idea of HTTP methods. So when you request a web page, that's a GET, right? HTTP GET. And so you can put a method on your page model class, your class that derives from the page model, that says on get, right? And so all of the code in that method will execute when this page, this Razor page, is requested with a get. Likewise, if you post back to that same page, you can have another method on post, on delete, on put, right? Now, all of these HTTP methods. And so that's kind of how the model works, right? And so when we're talking about a full-fledged development model, when you're actually not just serving content and retrieving content and data from the server, but actually being able to send content back, edit data, save data back to the database,
right?
You have this kind of full round trip. So it is not web forms most notably because it's lacking that binding.
Sure.
Those user controls and the binding, That was all very powerful stuff. So it still is much more tightly or much more closely related to Razor in MVC because you're still having to write all of that HTML yourself. Or in other words, you've got full control of the HTML that you're writing, for better or worse.
But it sounds like it's more set up to do JavaScript AJAX calls with JSON into the gets and the puts and the deletes and all that stuff that exists right in that page.
Exactly. So that's the interesting thing, though. I mean, generally with this model, you're still preferring these kind of full page postbacks, for lack of a better term. I don't want to use a web forms term, but you're posting back, right? You're not using the web forms postback. You are creating a form, an HTML form, and then posting back that form. And then your page is handling that postback, doing whatever it needs to do, and then re-rendering that same page. Of course, you can be redirecting to other pages and all that stuff, which use kind of similar mechanisms as you would in MVC in your controllers, right? You've got a redirect method, you've got a file method, content method. In fact, many of those things are exactly as they are. They're literally the same mechanisms that MVC provides you because this is all built on top of MVC.
Got it.
So it's all very interesting the way that it works.
It seems like it's sort of MVC and Web API and Razor are all just sort of updated for so that it works well with today's modern JavaScript frameworks and code and that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, but it's still very much server side.
Yeah, sure.
So the very interesting thing that happened to me was in the very early days of .NET Core. Right. So this has nothing to do with Razor Pages, but I promise I'll make it relevant later.
Yeah, we'll get there.
I went to a hackathon. I went to the MVP Summit. And on the last day, we had a hackathon with the ASP.NET team. And so I came in 8:30, opened up my laptop, started coding. And around lunchtime, I look up and I realize that I'd spent about an hour and a half using ASP.NET Core. And the rest of the time, I'd been building an Angular application. So I had used ASP.NET Core to create my web API to host and manage my data.
Yeah.
And then I just, without even thinking about it, I jumped right to the client side and I started doing client side stuff. And I mean, that might just speak to me that, maybe I'm just more comfortable on the client side, but
I think most web developers today spend more time on the client.
I think so. I mean, I've been doing this for almost 20 years now. And so, I've spent more than 10 years on the server side. I'm very familiar on the server side, but now the client side, just generally speaking, seems to be the right place to be. And so that really, really took me by surprise. And so that was when I was evaluating ASP.NET Core. And now recently, as I've been evaluating Razor Pages, it's a great way. It's a very productive way to create server-side rendered content. But what is the relevance of server-side rendered content these days?
That's a good question.
Right. I mean, for me, with the power of the browser, and more importantly, the browsers have matured so far now that the browser is a development platform.
Yeah.
Right. I don't think these frameworks like Angular and React and all the other great ones, I don't think they are a better way to do DOM-based development. I think they're kind of a validation of the fact that the browser is a platform. It's there.
Right.
I think it's becoming the new smart client host. It's just a host environment. And I think PWA really manifests that. As soon as you're no longer dependent on a connection and you can queue resources and and you're running in the background, tell me where the web app ends and the app begins. There's just not that much difference anymore.
PWA being Progressive Web Apps. Just want to be the acronym police for new listeners.
Yeah. So then it's very interesting where you think about what belongs on the server and what belongs on the client. And for me, I mean, it's interesting, Richard, that you bring up PWA apps, just apps in general, right? Because I think for me, a very crucial part of an application. But there's two things. First of all, there are websites, very content-driven marketing sites like Walmart. And I'll get back to them.
Smart brochureware.
Yes, where you're just spitting out content and you're cashing the heck out of it, and you're just trying to deliver that page as fast as possible so that you don't lose that sale. And then there are applications, web applications that happen to live on the web, happen to be built with web technologies, but applications where
fill out your tax forms.
Right.
Don't press the back button.
Exactly. But don't press the back button because the back button might mess up your state. Right? These applications are things that you're opening up and you're going to be working on for a while. And as you're working on them, that application is going to keep track of your state.
That's right.
Sure.
And so for me, the real true differentiation of server side versus client side is not actually where it's rendered, but where that state lives.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And so that was one of the big things as well with web forms is you had, view state was...
It lived in both places.
It was an attempt to capture and basically transmit along with the request the state of that application.
Yeah.
Because we sure as heck don't want that state living on the server because that is very expensive, right? But we are making server-side calls, so the server needs to know about that state.
Right.
And so that was their solution to that problem. And it tended to be pretty painful because you were trying to have that state living in two different places.
Well, you stored it in a logical place, which was the client, but the person who actually needed it was the server. So you had to keep hauling it up. As opposed to, this modern way now with a SPA, with the Angular type frameworks and stuff, is you compose your state on the client, and only when you're ready to complete do you finally haul it up to the server.
Yeah.
Exactly. The server ends up acting as the data source.
Right.
Just a repository. the data repository. And more importantly, it's stateless, right? To call that out very specifically. So that's really the architectural pattern that I've been driving toward a lot. And, as with anything, architecturally speaking, it depends, right?
Sure.
So this isn't a prescription, but I just see myself using this pattern and others using this pattern in a lot of places where you have these really stateless web API on the back end, handling the data and even providing business logic and all of that stuff. Stateless meaning, the resources on the server don't have to be too intense and that they tend to be pretty fast, right? Yeah. Because they don't have to rehydrate all that state.
Yep.
Right.
And then you keep that application state on the client where it should be. So you're not passing it back and forth. And then whenever you need to sync the client state, the changes you made to the data on the client, and you need to sync that data back to the source, you make a web API call. It's just like if you're on the server and you need to save that data back to a database.
Right. Sure.
You get to a point of consistency with a client, right? Where it's like you've done the validation on the client, you've accumulated the state on the client, you've gotten to a valid state with that state on the client, and now you're ready to ship it, as opposed to all of my validation actually happens on the server, and I have to keep passing it back, or I'm. You think of the two models before we talk about those late ones. The old ones were like the view state, where you're maintaining the state on the client, but you're constantly hauling it to the server to validate it, or the maintain a token on the client, aka a cookie, hauling back to the server so the server can fetch state, make a modification, make a validation, store again, go again. Both are slow. They move too much. They either move too much data or they are just too latent. But keeping the state on the client the whole time means it's got to be smart enough to get to a reliable state to say, this is something postable. This is something meaningful.
There were good hacks, though. I remember interviewing Dino Esposito, back in probably within the first 20 podcasts, maybe, of .NET Rocks. And he had written a book that, was like 9,000 pages long on ASP.NET. And I think it was when ASP.NET 2.0 came out. .NET 2, and he had a hack for using an event that happens on the server side in the session, I think, which was a pre and post storage. It was a fetch and a pre-fetch and a post send it back. I can't remember the exact terms, but he used that to serialize the session state and save it as a file. Just a bunch of files on the file system, because that was the fastest way to just persist data that could be cleaned up later. And we used that, and it worked really well. And of course, Richard, worked with Strangeloop, and they had a hardware device that made some of those problems go away in the middle. Yeah. But so there always been hacks. But you're right. I mean, you don't want that. You definitely want this. We like this new world a lot better, where state is composed on the client and data just is as needed sent around, but only as needed.
Yeah, I think that this became very obvious to me years ago when I was working on an ASP.NET web forms application, and it was more of one of those wizard applications, right? It was effectively building this really big object, but I didn't want to run the validation on the whole object because I haven't gotten to step 10 yet.
Right.
On step 1, I don't want to run the full validation.
Sure.
I just want to run it when the user finally says, yes, I'm done.
Right.
Carl, you mentioned taxes earlier, right? That's the perfect example, right? Like, I don't want to submit the tax form or even validate it until I'm completely done. And so when I'm writing this in a web forms application, and each of those steps in the wizard is a post back to the server. Yeah. Now I'm trying to figure out, if I'm on step 3, then go to the next step or just validate this much or whatever. And I'm jumping through all these hoops.
But there are validations that happen along the way, like as you're typing in your social security number and you put in a letter or something, and obviously that's not going to fly, but those things can happen. But you can validate little pieces of it. But you're right, the whole thing doesn't get validated until you push that button.
Yep.
Yeah. And some can happen at the client, and ultimately it happens at the server.
Yep. Yep. So, I mean, I think we're in an interesting world here. I think it was pretty sure it was somebody on your show a while back who was talking about the peaks and valleys, or the ebbs and flows of client side versus server side UI, right? And the history, it was someone far more experienced and, far more years under their belt than I, but they were talking about, we had, thick clients early on, and then it all went full onto the client, and then it went back to the server and everything. The real reason I'm really bullish on the browser-based applications at this point, client-side browser-based applications, is because of what I mentioned earlier, that the browser has just become a truly legitimate development platform right now. And in the beginning of the browser, when we had things like jQuery helping us just kind of manipulate DOM better, it was really, really lacking. But now we've got a whole lot of the HTML5 APIs and all that stuff and these really, really mature and helpful frameworks like React and Angular, where we can easily write full-blown applications on the server or on the client and sync back to the server using technologies like ASP.NET Core, ASP.NET MVC.
Hey, Richard.
Yeah, buddy.
Well, guess what time it is now?
It must be that happy time again.
Yeah, man. It's time to pull out the strop to hone up our messaging on today's topic. So here's a nice wet joke for you.
Wet joke?
Razor, get it, Razor?
Oh, save me.
Pull out the strop, hone up. Jeez, do I have to explain all my jokes? You're a genius. How come I have to explain my jokes to you, Richard?
The metaphors.
Not that sharp.
Oh!
I'm more of an electric guy. Sorry. Yep.
It's actually time to give away a D-Experience subscription to one lucky member of the .NET Rocks fan club. Become a UI superhero with DevExpress UI controls and libraries, and deliver elegant .NET solutions that address customer needs today, and leverage your existing knowledge to build next-generation, touch-enabled solutions for tomorrow. Whether it's an Office-inspired application or a data-centric analytics dashboard, DevExpress Universal ships with everything you'll need to build your best without limits or compromise. And check out their DevExtreme React Grid, built from the ground up to fully support all the cool features that come with React, like the virtual DOM, state controllers like Redux. It supports master detail, sorting, grouping, paging, and editing. And you can check it out and test it for free on GitHub. But learn more and download your free 30-day trial of DevExpress Universal at devexpress.com/superhero.
Well, all right, buddy. Who's our winner?
Today's winner, Richard, is Mitchell Tilbrook.
Congratulations, Mitchell. Golf clap for you, sir.
Golf clap for Mitchell. Mitchell just won the D-Experience subscription, a big pile of awesome from them, just for being a member of the .NET Rocks fan club. And if you don't know what that is, go to .NETRocks.com, click on the big Get Free Stuff button, answer a few questions, and join the fan club. We have thousands of members all over the world, and every show we like to give away stuff from our sponsors. And every December we give away a $5,000 technology shopping spree to one lucky member of the .NET Rocks fan club. But you have to sign up to win. And of course, you know what's coming now. Jess, if you had $5,000 to spend on technology today, what would you buy?
Yeah. So I'd spend it on two different things, two different categories of things, really. I got a whole list of stuff. I'd take probably the first 2,000 or so and really beef up my mini recording studio. So nice. I do the podcast, I do lynda.com training videos and all of that. And while I do have a decent, headset and the audio equipment.
By the way, I'm looking at Jess right now. He doesn't just have a decent headset. He looks like an NFL broadcaster. He's got you need to be in a hurricane somewhere with that thing. That looks awesome.
No, yeah, it's really nice. But my problem is I'm down in my basement. I got all this drywall. I got kids, running upstairs. And so I'd take the money and kind of build a couple of walls, put some sound baffling in. Not exactly technology, but really help my audio.
Well, it's funny you should say that because Richard and I both have these booths that we got at Pwop Studios from soundsuckers.com, and they're 6x4 isolation booths. And they cost exactly $5,000.
Yeah, so. I don't want to spend the whole $5,000 on that, though.
Just saying, you could.
Because so more important to me, because the reason I haven't done that yet is because more important to me, I want to spend the rest of the money on STEM stuff for my 3 daughters. So,
awesome.
Yes, I've got 3 daughters. One of them, the oldest one, is 7.5 now, and so she's at that perfect age. Yeah. She's at that transitional age, that key age where she's starting to look at her friends, and her friends are starting to validate whether or not tech and STEM is cool.
Right.
And so I really need her. I don't need her. She can do whatever she wants to, but I need her to know that if she's interested in it, if she thinks it's cool, then, don't worry about what they say. And honestly, the reverse, sell them on it. Say, hey, it's cool. Check this out.
Right. You be the leader.
And that's why she's going to school in a HoloLens.
Don't shoot me with that thing. Her friends will be like all scared.
So the number one thing that's on top of my list, I mean, I've been looking at Mindstorms, Lego Mindstorms for years, but they're a little bit too expensive for me. So what just came out is Lego Boost. Basically, it's a Mindstorms for, first of all, it's cheaper, half the price. And it's a kit for 7 to 9 year olds. Wow. So it's like, it is perfect for her because it uses basically a derivative of the Scratch program on the iPad. And so it's all drag and drop. And so they're doing kind of that logic of, move forward 5 times, then turn left once and then move forward. But it's all drag and drop. It's a very great interface. And they're creating Lego creations and making them move just like Mindstorms.
That is so cool.
It's really cool, and it's only like $160. So I'd probably maybe get a couple more of them. Maybe one for her whole class.
Christmas presents.
There you go.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Birthday presents.
I'd also probably get a Mindstorm set or two also for when she gets older, so she can grow into it. The next thing is probably a couple of Jewel Bots.
Yeah, Jewel Bots are cool.
Yeah, they're pretty cheap. I haven't quite gotten them yet because my girls aren't old enough.
Yeah.
Yes. And the cool thing is, to put in a little plug, Sarah Chips is actually doing a workshop for kids at the Tech Bash conference in October that I'm helping organize.
Nice.
So I'm really excited to see them and play with them there. And hopefully my kids will come and play with them there too. So, and then finally, I mean, what good is all of this stuff if you don't have a 3D printer, right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So I'm usually pretty good at justifying my gadget purchases, but this is like the one thing that I haven't been able to come up with an argument for my wife.
Wait a minute. I actually have a video of a guy who made a 3D printer out of a Raspberry Pi and a table saw and a hot glue gun. Just saying.
Right.
Yeah, I have so far resisted the 3D printer as well. I was waiting for any one of my girls to go, oh, I wish we had that, and boom, I would have gotten one.
Yeah.
Because they do more 3D stuff than I would ever hope to do. They're all in the cosplay and crafting. It's like, I can get a printer, never bit.
Yep. I imagine the most usage I would get out of it is 3D printing Mousetrap replacement parts for the game Mousetrap.
Oh,
brilliant.
How cool is that?
Brilliant.
How many times have you lost the basketball hoop or stepped on it because some kid left it on the foot? Oh, man, that's awesome.
Yeah.
That is a brilliant, brilliant idea. I love it.
So what has been the reaction to Razor Pages? You said that you had some adverse reaction to people who just didn't like the change, but what about people who actually get into it?
So that's interesting. I think it's pretty split. It is pretty split. You had that reaction on the docs where it was, burn it with fire. This is awful. This is going to encourage bad code. I already touched on that, right? It is not going to make you write bad code.
Yeah, of course.
That is a ridiculous statement, right? I do see where they're coming from, though, in that, right? So I think when we're talking about frameworks making you write bad code or bad code in frameworks, it's really the way that the framework encourages you to do things, right? So when I talked earlier, as MVC creates a model, view, and controller, it's encouraging you, hey, put your logic in the model.
Right.
You just do minimal stuff in the controller, just build up a view model to give to the view,
right,
and then make your view simple, right? And so in that way, as it combines those things together, you do run into I don't want to overstate it. I'm trying to avoid the word dangerous, but it kind of encourages you to put everything in the view, or at the very least in the back, in the code behind,
right,
in that page right behind, right? Now, if you are putting all of that logic in that code behind page, and you can test that page, and you don't have a giant application where you're trying to reuse all this logic and everything, hey, yeah, sure, that'd be great, right? I think the folks who are really disliking it are not, they don't dislike the framework or the model per se. They're really reacting to the fact that it doesn't really match their scenario. It doesn't match their use case.
Right. And as you said before, the server-side rendering is really there's a handful of types of websites that really benefit from this, right? Like blogs and news sites and marketing sites and things like that.
Exactly. So, right. There's a ton of folks just building very stateful applications with a lot of interaction on the client. Well, why are you doing anything on the server really other than managing data, right? You should be on the client, right? Certainly. But yes, as you just said, as we said earlier, there are folks like Walmart or, those big the folks who are just trying to generate content where it's pretty much a perfect fit, right? It is very much nice and simple. If you right now have an MVC application with a bunch of controllers that just say return view.
Yeah. You might be a redneck.
Exactly. But that's the interesting thing, though, because Razor Pages is built on MVC, you don't have to choose.
Yeah, sure.
So you've got two avenues here. In your MVC application, you can just throw in a Razor page or two, to satisfy those scenarios, or vice versa. Your application starts small. It starts simple, quote, simple, right?
Sure.
And it starts with this simple thing where I just need to display some stuff and then maybe do a simple post back. And then it starts growing and building where then you grow into MVC. Then when you get too much logic in that Razor page, it's not that the model is encouraging you to put a lot of logic in there. It's that you've probably outgrown Razor Pages. Right? At that point, maybe make a controller, make a view, make a model. And, and the interesting thing that I've been doing with it lately as well is there's nothing stopping you from creating additional classes outside of this view and code behind to actually hold all that logic.
Right. You're not saying use it for everything. You're saying if you just have simple pages, then you want to avoid all the ceremony, just use a Razor page.
Exactly. So there are these scenarios where it is working out really nice, and it is a really good a good thing to have.
Well, and it looks like something you can add into. You've got an existing MVC site, and you're jumping through a few too many hoops for some of the features you're building, and suddenly a Razor page is a simple way to solve that problem.
Yep.
Yeah, makes sense to me. So, is there anything else that we can talk about on the server side?
Well, so I think that it is very interesting to talk about server-side rendering of client-side applications. Right. Right. So we've been talking about an either-or proposition, and these days it's just really not. So it's very interesting to talk about the advances we've seen in things like Angular or React, or I keep bringing up Walmart very specifically because they've recently, Walmart Labs, their kind of engineering department, they're very open about what they do. They release a lot of open source projects, the stuff that they're actually using on Walmart.com and other sites. So they have a framework, a server-side rendering framework called Electrode. I believe it's Electrode.io. And so what this framework does, as far as I could tell, it ties into React. So I haven't actually used this framework. I've read a lot about it. And then similar to Angular Universal. Right, Angular Universal is you've got an Angular app, and then Angular has server-side rendering. Angular Universal is kind of the spec of how you do that, right? So that server-side obviously can be in any server-side technology that you want, as long as it provides things to Angular that adhere to this spec. And then I haven't looked into it too much, but React also has some server-side rendering pieces. It looks like the most compelling one is that Redux can do server-side rendering.
Right.
So now, this is very interesting in that it looks like where most of these things focus on is rendering that initial page load, making that initial page load really super fast.
Right.
The reason I keep coming back to Walmart is because we just said that Razor Pages is kind of like the ideal fit for something like Walmart, where you're just rendering some content and you're rendering it really fast. But Walmart wants to go above and beyond that, right? Walmart wants that. It wants that content that's rendered really fast, and then it wants to produce a very engaging experience.
Yeah, a spa-like thing.
Yes, a spa-like experience. Not a whole lot of state, because as you move along the site, you're probably doing a full page, request to a different page and loading that page again. But they definitely want those features that React gives you, and so it seems like these frameworks are all basically focused on making that first page load really, really fast, particularly with a focus on either rendering the data, collecting that data and basically hydrating that state on the server, dehydrating it, sending it over to the client, and then the first thing the client does is rehydrate it, and there you go. Or some of them are actually kind of pre-rendering views on the server as well. It's kind of the two ways that you can approach it, that you can leverage server-side rendering in a client-side app.
I mean, coming at it from a e-commerce performance perspective, like this is stuff we did at Strangeloop, where you're trying to get over the bounce rate. Like anything I can do to get someone engaged enough to click on the second page. Right. That's my bounces. They only hit the first page. They never went anywhere else. And I had sites that were successful and productive with an 80% bounce, which is like they, to me, also spoke to, you got the wrong SEO. You're sending people to the site that they shouldn't go to.
Yeah.
But, this absolutely optimizing the landing page to the point where we had a tool inside of Strangeloop we were experimenting with that would just literally pre-render everything. So there was nothing additional being loaded. Images, everything you can think of on a page, just literally put in the dock. One big page. So that just went boom, it was fastest render possible. With the goal to get them to that next page. And I think you're hinting at a big thing here, which is that these SPA models, your Angular and so forth, there's a bit of overhead for the first page. I mean, after that, browser cache takes over and it's not so bad. But you make your landing page suck, and that hurts your bounce rate.
Yeah, absolutely. And Amazon is a great example too, because, even when you're taking that whole page, clearly there's a lot of conversation about above the fold, below the fold. If you can't see it, if it's below what you're actually looking at on your monitor, why are you even rendering it at all? That's secondary almost by definition. But even above the fold, even what you're looking at, there's even some key information there too. On something like Amazon, you got the pictures of the product, the description, the price, the name, those 10, 20, 30 things that just need to be there. Everything else can kind of load dynamically, load after the fact. Right. And so you can mix these styles, whereas you're pre-rendering a lot of stuff on the server and then shipping that down to still use a client-side framework, still have a client-side experience, but pop up those very important things right away and then load that other stuff.
That was one of the sneaky things we did with landing pages, is that after the page was rendered, then we ran JavaScript that started preloading resources you were going to need for subsequent pages. So you still got your SPA experience. You just didn't, the customer couldn't tell they paid the SPA penalty because we distracted them with something else.
The real danger that you get in here is trying to mix it, right? Trying to mix that client side and server side. So I've seen other people try to basically render something using a server side rendering framework like Razor Pages, render that on the server and kind of import it or tie it into an already existing running client-side application like Angular, and it's the state problem. Right. The state of your client side has drifted. It's just completely different than what's on the server than the server knows about, unless you're trying to keep them in sync, which is just a nightmare as well. And so, but where I've seen this really, really work, I was working years ago at a place, I'm not really sure I can say the name, but one of the things you could do in the application was open up an article. Okay. And so this article is tons of text. And this text was marked up with links and everything, right? And so because we were in SPA land, we were building a SPA, our initial implementation of that was go and grab the data of that article. Go and grab that article as text and then render it as HTML in the browser. Ridiculously slow, insanely slow. Even if we did something like we were talking about, even if we hydrated it on the server and then and dehydrated it on the client, just rendering it
was costly.
Yeah, just rendering it was really, really slow. And so we just took the content of that article, created an endpoint in the web API at that point, and it returned HTML. And then at that point, we took that HTML, plopped it in the DOM. It was still a little bit expensive, but hey, it was a big article. It was a lot of text. And so that was a really good approach to kind of merge the two. Again, the key thing there being there was no state in this article. Literally everyone in the world who would read this article reading the same exact article. So there was not even any dynamic parts of it. There was
cache.
Exactly. Yeah, on the server it was cached. Right. It was cached very aggressively.
Nothing to cache. That's dynamic, right?
Yeah. And then I've also applied these other techniques of, hydrating on the server and then rehydrating in the client, that initial data payload. You don't have to be using Angular Universal or Electrode to do that. You can kind of home roll that too, though. it is very interesting that this is becoming more mainstream, right? This is becoming one of those key features of these client side applications. So
when it comes to mixing the two, you're okay with the landing page model being server side rendered,
yes.
But the moment you're going to start managing state, get to the client and continue operating.
Yes, at a very high level, it's the difference between, are you writing a website or a web page that is primarily content focused, even if there is interaction, right? Is it content focused versus an application that you're going to be living in for a while? And again, more specifically, you're going to be building state. You're going to be manipulating state, and that state will be changing. And you can mix them in the same site, right? You can jump from page to page. One page is content focused, and the other is, has state and is more of an application.
So what's next for you? What's in your inbox?
Well, so I'm actually working on a Razor Pages course for lynda.com. Not to pitch that too much here.
That's fine.
But coming up after that is Tech Bash, the Tech Bash conference. That is a relatively new. We had the first one last year, but it's a new dev conference in the Northeast U.S. So it's actually in the Poconos Mountains, in Pennsylvania. Yes, and it's at the Kalahari.
Another Kalahari.
Yeah, another Kalahari, and that's no coincidence. We were introduced.
Nice.
Yep. Yeah, we were going to speak last year, but we couldn't make it work.
Yeah, scheduling.
We're trying to get you guys. We would love to have you guys in.
Yes, I know. Yeah.
Our schedules are a bit hairy.
And they're getting hairier.
So that it's only our second year. We're still growing, but it's a lot of fun, and it's interesting the way you can spin things, right? Because last year we only had 400 attendees, and so we were able to call it an intimate conference. You can go and have fun. The attendee to speaker ratio was such that you could go and have an intimate conversation with the speakers.
Sure.
And so
it's like you're in a stadium.
Right. It's fun. It's obviously we're hoping to grow, we're hoping to build out, but it is what it is, and honestly, it's very fun and getting a lot of good feedback.
Awesome, Jess. Thanks a lot. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. This is great.
Make sure you come back again.
Definitely.
All right. And we'll see you next time on .NET Rocks. .NET Rocks is brought to you by Franklin's Net and produced by Plop Studios, a full-service audio, video, and post-production facility located physically in New London, Connecticut, and of course in the cloud. Online at pwop.com. Visit our website at dotnetrocks.com for RSS feeds, downloads, mobile apps, comments, and access to the full archives going back to show number 1, recorded in September 2002. And make sure you check out our sponsors. They keep us in business. Now go write some code. See you next time. Got transmitter banned by the FCC. Yes, I'm a